All hands, ocean mysteries, wise men and maidens, songbirds fly breeze, whispers, audience, ocean mysteries, wise men and maidens, songbirds fly breeze.
What got you into the Celtic cross?
I was brought up in the west of Scotland as a child, so I was interested in nature and I was always questioning. I always remember at primary school one of the questions that a teacher posed to me. I posed to a teacher was that I really wanted to know when the Ice Age ended. And at that time, which was in the early 50s, I was told 40 million years. It makes sense to me because there were shells and things in my garden that I'd noticed. And so I really set about trying to find out the answers for things for myself. I guess came to the cross conclusion after 40 odd years of looking. What surprised me about it was that I was brought up in the west of Scotland, which is full of Celtic crosses and wheel crosses, and I, like every other human being, walked past them and just saw them as part of the background.
Yeah.
And what, a gravestone marker, something you see in the church. Never thought about the meaning, and it's only later in life that I realised that nobody ever makes anything that doesn't have meaning. And so therefore you should look at the meaning of every image you ever see.
Yeah. So, just from a standard historical point of view, what is the Celtic cross to the rest of the world?
Well, it's a religious icon. There's a huge history about where it came from.
Yeah.
It became absorbed in religion. I think it probably became absorbed in religion by Constantine. The Emperor Constantine was at war at the time with 5 other Caesars. But Constantine's very interesting because Constantine was a Gaul, and the Gallic people, or the Gallic people if you like, really were spread from France, North Spain, Portugal, Cornwall, the United Kingdom, all the peripheral coastal areas up to Scotland, including Ireland. Now of course I found out they travelled much further than that. But the interesting thing about him coming from Gaul was that it was around the time of Christ that Caesar was busily chopping the Gauls apart in northern Europe. And I think they had, I can't remember, 10,000 troops or something. I think the French Asterix, the Gaul, is a reflection of those days.
Right.
But one of the symbols of the Gallic people, if you like, was the wheel cross, or Odin's wheel.
Right.
And what's known now as the Chi-Rho cross was raised by Constantine as a replacement, if you like, for the Christian sign of the fish.
Right.
Now, interestingly enough, the sign of the fish, which is still the Pope's hat, and the sign of born-again Christians on the back of the cars, and so the sign of the fish is for the age of Pisces.
Right.
Hence it really comes very much from the disciples of Christ were sent out to be fishers of men in the age of the fish, in the age of Pisces, to save the lost souls of the fish people, which we still are. Whereas Christ himself was the shepherd, good shepherd, the last in the line of the age of Aries, the shepherd kings, the Hyksos kings, the pharaohs and so forth. So what happened then with Constantine was that Constantine took what was really an underground religion at the time and raised it to become the state religion. Hence the cross was placed as the symbol.
So the cross originated with the Gauls, or does it go older than that?
No, it's much, much older than that, and it goes back in some, you can see it all over the world. It was in South America in 10,000 years ago. Particularly northern Scandinavia and so forth, you see boats associated with wheeled crosses in 1300 BC.
Yeah.
And
very arc-like.
very much so, and there were arcs drawn all over the world. Of course, arc, as you know, has got many connotations, but really it's a boat at the end of the day. And the Egyptians, of course, have crosses. What happened very much was when Christianity went berserk, as so does Islam, they destroyed a lot of the information that was kept at Alexandria, which the Greek Egyptians, if you like, Cleopatra had moved all the information from Heliopolis and placed it in an accessible place at Alexandria. And then of course Christians and Muslims proceeded at various times to destroy it. And I think in those days it wasn't wise to be an intellectual, because you probably heard what happened to the librarians. They were taken into the street and the skin and flesh was scraped off while they were alive with abalone shells by these born-again zealots.
Right. There's a message to librarians of today.
Oh, absolutely.
You're very brave people.
Very brave people indeed.
So it's originated at least 10,000 years ago?
Yes, originated at least 10,000 years ago, but there is evidence that such an instrument that I've discovered it to be was probably in existence 32,000 years ago.
32.
Good chance 27,000 years ago in the caves of Lascaux. Now there is a bit of an argument about whether or not the caves of Lascaux were painted 14,000 years ago or 27,000 years ago, but it has to do with carbon dating.
These are the caves in southern France?
These are the caves in southern France. Now what you have as an issue in evidence there is Taurus the bull. Now of course what we see is a herd of bulls galloping across, but some academics researching it found, I think the German academics have found two things. And one, above the shoulder of the bull is the Pleiades, in perfect position for the star sign Taurus as we know it today.
What is the Pleiades?
The Pleiades is Seven Sisters, which is a group of stars which is actually above the constellation of Taurus,
right,
the bull. But also the cycles of the moon below it. So what they see then is that this is really a bull image painted on these cave walls somewhere long before the end of the Ice Age.
Right.
Which is really, you're talking about now zodiacs and astrology, astrologic, thematic progression of the movements of the stars as they go around the Earth.
And so in relationship to this astrologic, in these caves, the cross was there? Yeah,
but that's not necessarily so, because there's no archaeological evidence. But what the evidence is that there's astrology employed.
Right.
Okay. Now to apply astrology, not in the modern pseudoscience way of looking at astrology, but astrologic, meaning mathematical use of the stars, requires a measurement of the angle to track them, if you like, to plan them. We certainly know for sure that astrology was employed by Mesopotamians and by Egyptians in 360 degrees, 365 days in a year, which they made up symbols for, but we know that they employed astrology.
And these are the same ancients who we can find the Celtic cross with, or versions of?
Versions of the Celtic cross.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially the Celtic cross is merely a protractor, a 360 degree protractor, broken down into 2,160 arc minutes,
right,
which was used by the Mesopotamians and by the Egyptians, and used really to measure the stars, which is why I go back to the caves of Lascaux and say that potentially 27,000 BC, they were using some kind of instrument that could measure 360 degrees.
Right. Yeah.
By the evidence that there was astrology used.
Right.
But what's really important is the understanding that the ancients in Lascaux and other places in France travelled because of the Venus figurines and because of the mammoth beads and so forth.
So you're saying 27,000 years ago people were navigating?
Yes, they
So-
had to navigate, to travel, and what a lot of people in modern times don't appreciate is because we're born with trains and buses and planes and so forth, is that navigation across land is virtually impossible. And particularly in those days, when you try and take on board the mammoths and the giant elk and the huge herds of creatures that were in the plains and tundras and mainlands of continental Europe, were huge creatures before they were made extinct and extremely dangerous, especially the saber-toothed tiger. And really humanity, in my view, for the last 180,000 years lived on the periphery. And the periphery is the edges of the continent where it joins the sea, and river mouths and places like that, where they weren't really exposed to the massive predators and herds, but yet were able to take advantage of them. And the spread of Venus figurines and the spread of the little beads, perfect little drilled beads made of mammoth tusk, from southern France right into northern Europe and into the Baltic regions and so forth, exactly the same type of manufactured item.
Yeah.
Okay, shows that these people travelled far and wide. To travel far and wide without roads means you have to travel by sea, but to travel by sea is fine. It's just how do you get up and down the estuaries and so forth. So we do still make boats like that. They're made in Ireland. They're called curras, and they're leather-bound boats. They're made of animal skin. And they float in only 18 inches of water. I mean, they travel around in this like family groups. There was Caesar in I think around 60 BC who commented that he'd seen boats like this on the Atlantic, up to 60, 70 feet long, and they flew like seagulls over the waves. It was so fast and so light. And so he reported them. We've got some information from that area. That was the case. The beauty about those kind of boats is that they can be put in the water and lifted out of the water. And what we find is there's evidence that these boats were turned upside down wherever they landed and used as roofs of houses. And you can see that by sod enclosures or stone enclosures that are boat shaped in Scandinavia, in the UK, in Ireland and so forth, and particularly the standing stones. And stones.
Why do you think Scandinavia seems so important to this tale of the Celtic cross and navigation?
Well, I think it's probably because of petroglyphs there. So they managed to recover petroglyphs that show the boats and also the wheel cross. So really when you look at the wheel cross as being a form of protractor associated with a boat, then you have to ask the very simple question: if these people were able to travel to the south of France for the winter and then up into the colder regions for the summer, they were probably following the herds. And the great thing about the shallow draft of these boats was that they were able to lie in ambush for the herds as they crossed river mouths and so forth. But I don't think I answered your question there.
No, the Scandinavians seem to be historically important to navigation because they're the ones that seem to have gone around invading lots of other countries in later times.
Well, there is an issue if you're talking about the Vikings now, but that's much later than you're talking 27,000
Are they not the descendants
BC.
of the Scandinavians that...
Well, it's very interesting because people do have difficulties by putting countries and labels on these people, and they were known as children of the earth, children of Geb, if you like, as far as the Egyptians were concerned, or sea people. But they didn't live on the land. This is what people can't get their heads around. They lived at sea, or they lived in the peripheries of the sea, and they were completely nomadic, going with the seasons.
Yeah.
Which brings me back to navigation.
Did not people ever set up settlements in these ancient times?
No, I don't think that they did.
Right.
I think that the reason that settlements came about was because of the end of the Ice Age. Now, in the end of the Ice Age, you had mile and a half high cliffs of solid ice as hard as steel, and anybody who's read about the Titanic knows that ice that's formed in the poles is extremely dense. And it will sink a steel ship.
Yeah.
And when the ice melted, it caused all sorts of ice dams, if you like, that push forward on the rain, and water in the middle raised to a great height. But when the cliffs of ice fell, they caused two tsunamis of unbelievable power. So that wiped out, at the same time as raising the sea levels up to 300 feet, wiping out a lot of our archaeological evidence, I'm sure. It wiped out the herds that the people were relied on for their hunting and for their food, kind of Garden of Eden, if you like, harvesting whatever was going north and south. Well, when the herds became wiped out, what happened was they decided or took on board agriculture. And that agriculture really started around 10 to 12,000 years ago, at the end of as we know it, at the end of the last ice age. And it was at that time that they started to settle. But some still stayed hunter-gathering, some settled and become farmers, and became a division, I suppose, between the people. And then there were, of course, people who bridged it, as there are today. There are fishing fleets that go out harvesting the sea,
Yes.
in the same way that farmers harvest the land.
Celtic cross,
Yeah.
getting back to that, we understand that it was used for navigation,
Yeah.
but then we now know that man settled
Uh-huh.
and created settlements around the world
Yeah.
at the end of the Ice Age. So what was the Celtic cross used for then, if man didn't need to navigate?
Well, man still needed to navigate,
Okay.
so that's only part of it.
It's for
Man-
trading and...
Yeah, trading and moving around, and still, I suppose, following the seasons to a degree.
Right.
Um,
Can the Celtic cross be used for anything else?
well, the thing about the Celtic cross is it really is an ancient concept, is as above, so below. What people don't realise, I suppose, is that before the advent of the watch, the creation of the watch, which is by Harrison, I suppose, right, in the 18th century, was the solving of longitude. Right? And the watch was named the watch after the watch keeping at sea, or
Oh,
keeping
right.
watch.
Right.
Okay, which may get some of our listeners interested because of the watchers and the followers of Horus.
Mm-hmm.
So come back to what it was then. The Celtic cross was a protractor that reflected the wheels of stars. Wheels of stars means Zodiac, which is Zodiac, or if you like, it's the arc of stars, the wheel of stars,
Yeah.
a wheel of animals.
Right.
And so the Celtic cross was a protractor based on that, based on the 360 degrees of stars that surround the sun and surround the earth, from which we kept time, from which we kept watch.
Right.
So the wheel cross, or the Celtic cross, is also a clock,
Okay.
a reflection of time by the stars.
Which is of paramount importance for people who were growing crops.
Absolutely, and also for the ceremonies that go with the thanksgiving from the sun. Now, it should go back to the Celtic cross and understand that wheel cross, or Odin's wheel, or the Celtic cross, is known as a solar symbol.
Right.
What people didn't realise was that it actually tracked the sun. See, the stars themselves are fixed. Most of them are fixed, and certainly in our lifetimes they're fixed.
Yeah.
And really what the ancients did was they fixed the stars gave them names from a shamanistic, animistic background. So you find zodiac creatures different from different cultivations, different peoples of the world use different types of symbology, but mostly it's based on what they see in nature around them, in the same as the as above so below shamanistic concept, animistic way.
Was there any animal that was the same?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because of course in Egypt they talk about the lion very much as being Leo, which we still use now, which the Greeks used, which logically is an acceptable way to go on, because the Greeks conquered Egypt, therefore they took some of their symbology. But there are some different kinds of zodiac signs that could be said to be the same, but it's actually not important. What's important is, look, let me give you an example. Southern Hemisphere, there is a constellation called the Typewriter. So that was named in our time by something that we were familiar with to recognize. So the idea of a zodiac sign is that you recognize that area of the sky by joining up the dots by using image. Okay, to join up the dots so that you could pass to your children's children or to anybody else a universal sign to recognize a position in the sky.
And does that give you a position of yourself on Earth?
In what way do you mean?
To know where you are.
Yes, it doesn't in itself. Okay, a zodiac sign doesn't in itself. It's what's between you and the zodiac sign. Now, for instance, the sun comes between you and the zodiac sign. So we have a very obvious thing that isn't well appreciated. If the Egyptians understood the zodiac as we know it in 360 degrees, and they also said such things as birth signs or sun signs, in other words, you were born in the age of Pisces or in Leo or so forth, you were born in the sign of Pisces or Leo, that would be called a birth sign or a sun sign or a star sign. It's quite obvious when you think about it that they had to know the Earth was round and that the Earth actually went round the Sun. It's impossible not to do so, because the star sign of Leo, if you were born in the age of, or in the time of Leo, okay, or in the day of Leo, I'm sorry, the Sun is between you and that star sign. Therefore you can't see it, it's daylight.
Right.
And the only way that you can tell what star sign the Sun is in is to know what's the opposite of it the night before.
Right.
So when you look at the night before at midnight, you look at the star sign in the sky, you're looking out into space. When you look into inner space towards the Sun and try to see the star sign on the other side of the Sun, you can't do it, so it's daylight. So you would need to know that the Earth went round the Sun, and you would need to know that the Earth was round.
Absolutely. Why do you think it's important to know whether you were born in Leo?
I don't personally think it's important to know.
Why do the ancients?
Well, they believed that the energy of life, that life itself, okay, that electromagnetic energy, whatever you want to call it, that spark of life came from the Sun.
Right.
They were very wise. They knew what we know scientifically today, that we are actually solar energy. What we eat, for instance, an apple, or we drink a bottle of wine. Now, one of the greatest examples, it gets more expensive as time goes by, but I like to buy a bottle of wine that was created the day my friend was born, or a friend was born, to give it to them as a birthday present, because what I'm doing is giving them a bottle of bottled solar energy from the year that they were born. As I said, it gets more expensive as I get older and they get older. But the concept behind it is that the grape that absorbed the sunlight through the leaves of the vine is now bottled energy, okay? And because you consume it, it becomes part of you, and therefore you are sunlight. Now we know that that's true today, but they knew it then. So what they said is the day that you were born was very important because of the influences of the positive and negative, and they cut it up like that, didn't they? They said, you know, earth, wind, fire and water, different solar energies dependent on the season, and of the influences of the planets that were around it created different characters in their view.
So this is the sun as the father of light, giving us life.
Giving us life. So if you think about the father-mother relationship, then the father seeds the earth with energy and created that energy together with the soil of the earth, or with the seed of mankind, or the seed of a lion, or the seed of a bird, or any of the species combined together creates a new life with the combination of those two items. So they saw that very clearly. And of course we know that that's true today. That's exactly how it is.
And that's where the origin of the worship of the sun.
Well, yes, I think that there were a lot of disputes, particularly in ancient Egypt, about this, whereby people actually the priests, if you like, worshipped the age of the Zodiac sign. In other words, what they were doing was they were worshipping the creative and destructive cycles of time. So they saw that as a pantheon of gods, which was based on the zodiacs. What happened was Akhenaten, he started a religion that really our monotheistic society comes from, which was based on that the sun gives life, and therefore the sun is the creator and the destroyer. And so from that point of view, he upset the priests, as it was, of Amun, which means Aries, Amun, Amen, that we say at the end of the Lord Prayer.
One thing that's always seen with this solar image of the atom is the serpent. Can you explain what you think?
Yes, the serpent around the atom, and it's actually said, I think, in the Book of the Dead and so forth, is that the sun, the north pole of the sun in astrology is directly in the first coil of the serpent as we know it. Well, funnily, in England we call it the worm. The Chinese call it the dragon, and so do a lot of Eastern ones, and it has many names. And in one part in Egypt they didn't have it as a dragon or a serpent at all, but they had it as a combination creature of hippopotamus, a lion, and a crocodile. And the reason for that was because it kills you as well as gives you life. It gives you life and it gives you death. It's dualistic in its way. As it spins, this serpent in the sky, which we know as the constellation Draconis, as it spins above the north pole of the sun, it takes away your life. So for instance, 70 times annual spin of that is your lifetime, from birth to death. Okay, so it controls both the forces of creation and destruction as they saw it.
And so it also measures time.
Measures time. So it spins at the rate of slightly less than 1 degree every 24 hours. So that's as the Earth travels around the Sun. But it also spins at the rate of 15 degrees every hour to give you the daily spin. So as the Earth spins, it spins, but at the same time at midnight, every night, it starts 1 degree slightly off its previous night's position.
That's incredibly accurate.
Incredibly accurate.
And so the ancients could have, the Egyptians, whoever they might be, would have been able to really hone down on the time of day.
Yes, they would.
Let alone the time of year.
Yes, they would, but you have to ask the question, which is the question I asked. Okay, if they could do that, what did they do it with?
And
You
the
see.
Celtic cross.
And the wheel crossing, well, actually the Egyptians developed it into a far more sophisticated instrument than the Celtic cross,
Right.
which is accurate. The one I've made is as a copy of the Dixon relics that are still partly in the pyramid and partly in the British Museum. It's accurate to 3 arc minutes.
Can you explain these Dixon relics to the people who don't know anything?
Yeah, Dixon relics were found in 1872 by a gentleman called Wayman Dixon. And a helper he had called Bill Grundy, and they were inside the Great Pyramid and noticed a tiny gap in the wall in the Queen's Chamber, and Bill Grundy was asked if he would breach the gap, knock it out, in other words. So he took a hammer and a chisel, wouldn't be able to do that today, and knocked this gap out, and what they found was shafts. And what they thought they were was air shafts, but when they breached the north shaft of the Queen's Chamber, some items fell out, and the items were a 1 pound 3 ounce ball of bluish grey granite, and a little bronze hook in the shape of the Aries sign, or the sign of Amun, Amen. Okay, certainly it's the Greek sign for Aries. And also what looked like was recorded to be part of a cubit rule.
You say recorded to be?
It was recorded to be that by Piazzi Smythe, who was the Astronomer Royal for Scotland. Because what happened was Wayman Dixon boxed these up into a cigar box and sent them back to Edinburgh, where they became obscurely lost and so forth. But it was recorded by Piazzi Smythe, the Astronomer Royal. He measured and weighed them, and
So what do you believe happened to this rod?
the rod's still in the pyramid.
It is still, yeah.
It's still in the pyramid, or it was the last time we saw it, because a guy called Rudolf Gantenbrink put up a tiny robot under the direction of Zahi Hawass, director of Egyptian antiquities. What happened was he created this robot to clear what were considered at the time to be air shafts, and are now said by Zahi Hawass and Mark Lenner of the Egyptian antiquities to be soul shafts, to clear them of debris, because what was happening was there was a lot of condensation being formed by visitors within the pyramids, and it was doing a damage to the inside. So to clear these shafts, you can get some air in, and that will take the humidity down. And in the King's Chamber shafts, they fitted fans, as I understand it, to blow air in and out. But what happened was that Gantenbrink, in sending his robot up the shaft, sent one up the north shaft of the Queen's Chamber, and at the top of the shaft can still be seen, under a rod that was reputedly sent up by Wayman Dixon at the time, and it's jammed up there, underneath it a very thin lat of wood with a fractured end, and then another piece with holes in it, which show that the little Aries hook fitted those.
Right.
So what we can tell from that, because that artifact was still there in 1993 and filmed to be so for posterity, was that part of the rod was still up the shaft at that time. However, since then, the Egyptian antiquities have sent up further robots. What they were really interested in was finding out what was lay behind the doors at the top of these shafts.
Right.
And no report has been made, since the robot would have had to have climbed over the one in the north shaft, would have to have climbed over the lat. No report was made or any filming done of that at that time.
You marvel
So that's the discovery of the Dixon relics and what they are. So how did this relate to the Celtic cross?
Well, what really happened, if you take you back to the beginning, when I discovered the Celtic cross originally, what had happened in this was in 1997. I had heard through various authors and academics that the Great Pyramid of Giza was aligned to the North Pole Star. That troubled me, of course, because there was no pole star at the time. But having said that it was aligned. And also I looked at it because I've got a background in design and architecture, and so has my family, and I thought, well, the instruments that they have are not adequate for the job. This is one of the most sophisticated buildings in the world. In the whole of our world now, there is not a building, even of smaller size, that is so well aligned. It's only a few centimetres out, and quite remarkable, apart from the tonnage and weight and so forth. I thought, this is not adequate. There were two instruments that we know about. One was called the bay and the other one was called the merchet. And these two instruments were plumb lines. One was really based on a palm leaf, and the other one is based on sort of if you like, an upright stick with a cross member sticking out of one side and then a plumb line hanging down it to get alignments. But neither of those instruments would do what's vitally important. What's vitally important to design something like the Great Pyramid, which incorporates its latitude and also the circumference of the Earth and the precession of the equinoxes, plus the seasons and the 12 signs of the Zodiac, all in one phenomenal conurbation. This is not just as Khufu's pyramid, but as the complete group of the Giza necropolis, if you like.
Yeah.
Was that it needed an instrument that could measure not just vertical angles, but horizontal angles. And that's the difficulty, and there was no instrument that could do that. And archaeology at the time, you must remember this is a long time ago now, it is 10 years, and there are people who are professors now in archaeology that were still at school when I made this discovery. Was that there was no instrument that would measure. And what kind of instrument we would be looking for? Well, we would be looking for an instrument that acted as a modern theodolite. Every housing estate that's ever built, everything that's ever constructed, the levels and the falls and the design and everything, you see guys out, they've got white or yellow hats on and they've got theodolites, and theodolites are for finding measurements and angles and so forth. And even when we create motorways and roads, highways if you like, the surveyor always aligns them to the pole stars. They need to find true north so that they can get their alignments right and so forth. So I'm looking for an instrument that can do that. I'm looking for an instrument that can act as a theodolite, and I can't find one. I was experimenting in my back garden. I thought, well, I know they've got pieces of wood, so let's muck about with a piece of wood. And what you should know, as well as having an understanding of surveying and construction and architecture, I'm also a sailor, so I have an understanding of navigation, and navigation for sailor also comes from understanding the stars. And in modern navigation and in modern astronomy, we still use zodiac signs.
Right.
Okay, that's really important. We divide the sky up into 360 degrees, all lined out beautifully on a grid, and we recognize the parts of the sky we're looking at by the constellations. Okay, so I'm looking at that, and I'm looking at astronomy, and I'm looking at my navigation experience, and I'm looking at my construction experience and my design experience, and I'm saying, how can I do it? So let's get a piece of wood. Let's start there. So take a piece of wood and stick it up to the pole star, okay, and sight along it. Fine, that's cool. That works, but not very well. It doesn't work very well because my hand isn't as steady as it ought to be, and so it shakes around this tiny dot in the sky. I need a support, so I need a fulcrum. A fulcrum, like a crossbar. I'm trying to make a T-piece now. So I make a T-piece, okay, and I balance the crossbar on a stick, and then I can get back and I can sort of sit down on my hunkers, or I can kneel down and I can sight up at the sky, and it's steady. Fine. That's great. What else did the Egyptians have that will help me? Well, I need to be able to make a scale, and I need to be able to make, well, The Egyptians used 360 degrees. They're great at arc. We know that they were great at geometry. We know that. So let's have a look at that. Okay, we know they have wheels and there's expressions of wheels with it, so we don't have any difficulty with that. And we know something else that's very important. There was a law in Egypt, and that was particularly used in the weighing of the heart ceremony, which made it a law, was a plumb line. When they do the weighing in the heart ceremony, they made scales, and the scales were weighing the heart against, in the canopic jar of the pharaoh, against the feather of truth, known as the feather of Maat. And if the heart was heavier than the feather of truth, honesty, justice, and so forth, then what happened is the pharaoh would be regenerated, and he wouldn't go to heaven, he wouldn't become a star. And this was the judgment that was placed on him for the way in which he looked after his people and ran his life. Well, they used a plumb line on the scales. They used it because it was a law, and they had to make sure that it was absolutely bang on, otherwise it would send the pharaoh in the wrong direction. If you get my meaning.
Yes.
And so we know that plumb lines were important. We know that the Egyptians used them to a great degree, and so let's just use a plumb line. So what's the basic thing we need? Well, we need a wheel, and we need to stick it on an upright, and we need a crossbar to sight along. But we also need something else. We need to be able to look at it in a horizontal direction as well as a vertical direction. And so we put a wheel on, and this is exactly what I did. I put a wheel on and I marked it out in 360 degrees using a simple protractor, extending the lines out so I could get it. And I got into my back garden and I sighted the pole star and I checked it against the GPS, and it was like within 20 miles.
Did you realise at that time that it looked like?
No, that was the whole point. I was standing there doing this and found myself kneeling in front of the cross and sighting the pole star, and it suddenly just hit. I thought, what is this? I've got a Celtic cross in my hand. I've seen these all my life. You know?
You weren't onto the Celtic cross at that
Wasn't
time?
onto the Celtic cross at all at the time.
Right.
What happened was I found that this was the only way in which I, using primitive thought, could basically measure an angle in the way that I wanted to. So I found that. Surprised, went off, researched it, did everything I could to research it on the internet. And
does this relate to the Dixon relics?
Well, yes, it does, and I'll tell you why. What happened was that I got distracted then, because I got, this is a Celtic cross, surely this is obvious, but I've never heard of it. Remember, I've been in surfing and navigation, I've been in astrology, so I've never heard of a cross and a wheel on it as being an instrument for measurement with a plumb line. And I went off and researched it, and then came up with all the things throughout the world of Celtic crosses and wheel crosses, and the connection with Scandinavia, Ireland, and the Vikings, all of this sort of business. And then eventually, after a period of about 1.5 years of research, went back to the Great Pyramid, which is what I'd started me investigating in the first place. And that's how I came about to see the Dixon relics for what they were, because prior to seeing the Dixon relics for what they were, if I hadn't have discovered the wheel cross, I wouldn't have recognised them. Okay, so what I found was that a more accurate way of, rather than a gigantic wheel cross, of dividing down each degree into arc minutes, okay, was to make what's known as an exponential scale. Now, an exponential scale is very simple. It's like the rays of the sun, or any angle that goes from the centre of zero outward.
Like the rays of the sun seen on the Akhenaten.
Absolutely,
The sun.
exactly right. And so that, in fact, in that case, you can also say that Akhenaten was quite well aware
Yes.
of this. Which is very similar to the rays of the sun from pictures of Akhenaten, showing life coming from the sun. The exponential scale is really a quarter of a circle, and it makes it much more accurate to do so, to make it like this, so that 1 degree comes broken down into 10 parts, similar to the decans stars used by the Egyptians for measuring 36 decans times 10 is 360 degrees. And breaking it down, it breaks it down into arc minutes. it a much smaller item to use for measuring with a plumb line. So if you can see that mounted on a cross staff, up and down, the plumb line hung from the top here, and what happens is the line, as it's tilted, measures off the angle along the degrees and arc minutes. And this is actually accurate to 3 arc miles at the equator of the Earth, which is very, very accurate indeed. It's 3 nautical miles, or 3 arc minutes, is a distance to the horizon, the place of time, the zone of Horus, if you like. And so I looked for an exponential scale, and the reason I wanted an exponential scale is that you reduce the size of the instrument. It's almost like a vernier. It reduces the size of the instrument from a wheel. So you have a very simple scale rule, and of course it sprang to mind at the time, you know, things like yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, your rod and your staff will comfort me, means something now. But the exponential scale broke it down to arc minutes, and it broke it down to an accuracy of 3 arc minutes. Now I knew that they were very good in textiles and so forth, so that they could make a thread strong enough yet thin enough to be measured, but also by knowing the width of the measurement of it, they could come down to the finest detail of measurement. But 3 arc minutes is remarkable accuracy. Let me tell you why. An arc minute is equal to a nautical mile at the Earth's circumference. And so now it all starts to knit together, because it was accurate to 3 arc minutes, brings it within the viewable horizon at the equator of 3 miles. So in other words, if you can find, by using the stars, a measurement within 3 arc minutes, you can be pretty sure you were in 3 nautical miles, or within the view of the horizon. Now of course that opens up other things. What does horizon mean? Well, it's Horus, you know. Horus is about time, zone, the time of place, horizon. We use words nowadays when you forget the roots of where they come. The cross in its time was a very powerful instrument, a weapon of war, if you like. If you could find the time, and you could judge the season, and you could measure your enemy's land or your own land, and you could bring your ships and your troops to any position you wanted at precisely the right time, it's a powerful, powerful weapon.
Especially in times of like the English and the Spanish and the French, who were empire building.
Very possibly. And certainly there's evidence to that effect. But I'm very cautious about making judgment, because what I have found is very like the atomic bomb. It's the concept of, can you uninvent it, and what was it for? What fascinated me about the cross was that it became buried and lost and hidden or not hidden or forgotten or whatever you want to call it. Those are all very emotive words. Was it lost, was it hidden, was it forgotten, or was it a combination of all those sort of things? It still couldn't die. And that's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
That no matter what people do, they can't get rid of something that's there, even if it goes underground. And the book I wrote, I must say, the book I wrote is called The Golden Thread of Time, because this knowledge is hung by a thread throughout time.
A lot of the time these lost things, we won't call them secrets, but these lost things are found in symbolism, within things like secret societies and religion.
Yes.
Did you find confirmation in anything?
Yes. It's fragmented. I mean, the cross is actually available in, let me give you an example, sextant. We talked about sextant earlier on as part of a navigational tool. It means the 60th part of a circle. Prior to the sextant, which was only invented after Harrison's chronometer, prior to that it was called the quadrant, which means a quarter of a circle. Now in between there was an oddball one, which was called the octant, which means an 8th part of a circle. But you see, to call them parts of circles, which is what they're saying, acknowledges that previously there was a full circle. have an issue, don't we? I mean, let me give you an example. The formation of the written language is pretty well known to be a development that came about through necessity after it became forbidden to use graven image.
Right.
So when it became forbidden in the Ten Commandments to use graven image, you now have an issue, don't you? The sign S means and sounds like serpent. So we're not allowed to draw serpents anymore because it's a graven image. So we make a very clever code, and that code becomes a letter. And then language is a letter. Very simplistic way of looking at it, but let's say that that's a way of doing it. Let's look at Greek mathematics. Now, Greek mathematics is totally unnecessary. I can teach a child to create a pyramid, incorporate pi, the golden section, square the circle, all the great Greek mathematical problems in 3 minutes flat. A child of 4 can do it every time and never make a mistake.
Why are we
Simple geometry.
So why are we so distracted from these basically core truths?
Very difficult to answer that question. People become fragmented. I've said many times before, it's not the ordinary person's fault. At the end of the day, they don't know, but very much in the beginning of this conversation we were talking about how I felt about the end of the Ice Age and what the teachers were saying. Well, the teachers were only saying what they'd been told to say. Case of the blind following the blind, you know. And was it they say in the kingdom of the blind the one-eyed man is king? Doesn't kind of help either. but the point very much is, what did your parents tell you? What did school tell you? Do you think for yourself? Or do you just accept that which is told to you?
So it's relevant for people today because
It's relevant for people today because if you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're going. And I guess from a lot of people's point of view, it shows that our ancestors were far more intelligent cerebrally than perhaps we are today, but that might not be fair. It could be that we're more specialised today and then we fail to look outside the box. It's the only instrument that will operate in the absence of GPS systems, and also and this is what you've got to take on board, which is really important, it operates in the absence of compasses. Now, as you may or may not know, the Earth is starting to go into a magnetic reversal. It only happens every 100 and so thousand years, they say. The Sun goes into a magnetic reversal every 11.5 years, standard, but the Earth, not so. But going into magnetic reversal, according to those scientists that are surveying it now, may not happen for the next 1,000 years. Certainly has been happening for the last couple of hundred years, because we're recording a reduction in the magnetic force on the Earth of around 10 degrees over that period of time. That it would take around about 2,000 years for it to redress itself and become stable. Now, so we've got magnetic reversals, quite complex thing to talk about, but if you can imagine, it's very much like the old oil lava lamps of water and oil. And so what we've got is little north poles appearing. The last one they recorded was appearing, little north pole off the south of South Africa in the southern hemisphere. And so if magnets don't work anymore, and there's an anomaly for finding your position, yes, you need to use the stars again. So certainly the principles involved in the Celtic cross are useful from a survival point of view. In terms of GPS systems, certainly what's happening is we've got increasing amount of global warming, which in my investigations shows to be more solar based, which brings us back to the sort of sun symbol again, the creator of life. Certainly our ancestors would have said that the global warming that we're experiencing over the last 100 years, which is accelerating, is caused by the sun, since it's our heat source. Is that the magnetic flares and so forth that come about, next peak solar maximum is in the year 2012, could knock out our GPS systems, could knock out our satellites and so forth. And yes, you do have an alternative method of navigation, but you need to resurrect the ancient ways to do that.
The ancients saw things in a great many ways and together,
Yes.
in unison.
Yes.
So there would be a spiritual element to it as well.
Yes.
Do you see that from your researches?
Yes, very much so. And I think again that's the issue. And one of the things that science has an issue with religion, and religion has an issue with science, is because of the misunderstandings of the interpretations in a religion often, but also because of the persecution of scientists in the last few hundred years. And so that caused a division between the two, and the two concepts couldn't merge. But of course man, as I say, man doesn't live by bread alone, and so we're all spiritual creatures as well as we're practical creatures, and we need to keep balance there and be able to do both. I often find in lectures I'm trying to talk to people who are right-brained, and there are people there who are left-brained, and you're trying to please all of the people all the time, but that's actually not my problem. It's their problem if they don't make an effort. And one of the things, a lot of human beings at the moment spend a lot of time on physical health, and I always found that's important, but within degrees. For instance, if we were supposed to be the strongest creatures on earth, we would have giant muscles. If we were supposed to be the fastest runners or the greatest killers, then we would be horrendous creatures with very little brain. And we were not put there for that. The most powerful muscle we have is our brain, and it needs exercising, and you can only do that when you're alive. So you need to exercise your brain by thinking, I guess that's quite important. Yeah.
And using the cross exercises the brain.
Well, it certainly brings you in line with nature again. It brings you closer to what nature's all about and the cycles of time. And
so this would have been sacred.
Yes, it would have been sacred. And I was asked the other day by somebody, I understand that the South American Indians didn't use wheels. Well, yeah, that's very much like we have an issue with why people used quadrants rather than a cross. Because a cross became a sacred item. It's a sacred thing, really.
The cross has been a solar symbol for an awful long time, hasn't it?
Long before Christianity.
Yeah. And is that why in your opinion, is that why Christianity used the cross?
Well, Christianity absorbed many things. Pagan religions absorbed very much into itself. Those things like Christmas, all the celebrations that were more Zodiac based, if you like, or astrologically based, or spiritually based on what they call paganism, were absorbed into Christianity as the new religion gathered strength.
And the cross is at the centre of Christianity, really.
Well, actually, the fish is.
The fish is, okay.
Pisces is, but it has become so since Constantine.
Yes.
And has become the centre of Christianity. And really what it is a computer for measuring the earth, the time, the sun, the moon.
Is there any relationship to nailing Christ to the cross?
It's quite interesting that an ex-minister said to me, that makes sense to me. He said, because Christ was then neither on the earth nor in heaven, but pinned in that moment of time between both.